Hello and welcome to today's webinar, What Are U.S. Households Paying to Get to Work? I am Sean Buckles and I'm your host for today's presentation. I'm the Head Statistical Officer and Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. If you're joining us for the second time, I want to personally apologize for the technical difficulties we encountered a few weeks ago during our originally scheduled webinar. We've resolved those technical difficulties and we're ready to go. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, you can submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar. To submit your questions, launch the Q&A pod from the bottom of your screen, type your question into the question box, and click the send button. We will get to as many of your questions today as possible. Secondly, the volume for today's webinar will be through your computer. Please use your computer's controls to adjust your sound levels. And lastly, your mics will be muted throughout today's webinar. With today's webinar, I hope to accomplish two goals. My first goal is to provide you a general overview of the commuting data we collected in the 2017 American Housing Survey. To achieve that goal, we'll begin by listening to a prepared presentation. The prepared presentation provides a brief introduction to the American Housing Survey, a review of the commuting topics, and some commuting data highlights. My second goal for this webinar is to help you understand how the American Housing Survey commuting data fits into the overall universe of commuting data collected by the federal government. That means we will be discussing a handful of other commuting data sources and how they compare to the American Housing Survey. To help me achieve my second goal, I will lead a discussion with two of the federal government's experts on commuting data. I'll be joined by Brian McKenzie from the U.S. Census Bureau and Claire Rachofsky from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics in the U.S. Department of Transportation. And finally, after our discussion, Brian, Clara, and I will take your questions. As a reminder, while we play the prepared presentation and during our discussion, feel free to post your questions in the chat box. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end. Now, please listen to this prepared presentation, and I will be back shortly.
What is the American Housing Survey? The American Housing Survey is the nation's most comprehensive housing survey. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, funds and provides oversight for the survey. The U.S. Census Bureau, or Census, collects the data. The American Housing Survey has provided current and continuous data on the U.S. housing stock and the people who occupy America's households since 1973. These days, the American Housing Survey is conducted every 2 years. We recently finished the 2019 data collection period, and we are looking forward to conducting the next American Housing Survey in 2021. HUD uses American Housing Survey data to examine issues that are critical to advancing our mission, improving our effectiveness, and designing housing programs that meet the needs of different target groups, including first-time homebuyers and older Americans. Policy analysts, program managers, and budget analysts in federal, state, and local governments use American Housing Survey data to monitor housing supply and demand, as well as changes in housing conditions and costs. Private organizations, including trade associations, use American Housing Survey data to study issues important to our member communities. Finally, academic researchers at our nation's universities and think tanks use the American Housing Survey data to gain a deeper understanding of housing policy issues, including housing affordability for low-income renters. The American Housing Survey provides current information on a wide range of core housing topics. Core housing topics are included in every survey and include the size and composition of the nation's housing inventory, vacancies, heating and cooking fuel usage, the physical condition of housing units, characteristics of occupants, equipment breakdowns, home improvements, mortgages and other housing costs, persons living in or eligible for assisted housing, home values, and characteristics of recent movers. In addition to the core topics, the American Housing Survey includes a series of rotating topical modules that collect data on a wide variety of housing-related topics of special interest to HUD and the American Housing Survey user community. These rotating modules provide unique insights on topics like health and safety hazards in the home, food insecurity, the use of housing counseling services, the presence of arts and cultural opportunities in the community, neighborhood characteristics, delinquent rent or mortgage payments, and emergency and disaster preparedness, among others. The American Housing Survey is a nationwide survey that is designed to produce national estimates for 25 large metropolitan areas, and estimates for certain states. You can find more information on the American Housing Survey, including several tutorial videos and documents on how to use tools like the American Housing Survey Table Creator and Codebook online at census.gov/programs-surveys/AHS. And now for today's topic, surveying commuting costs and modes of transportation. Why is HUD interested in commuting costs and modes of transportation? Where a household lives greatly impacts how much the household spends on transportation. HUD recognizes the close relationship between housing costs and the cost of commuting, or a person's travel from home to work. We include data on commuting costs and commuting modes in the American Housing Survey, also known as the AHS, to ensure that the survey provides users with the best, most comprehensive housing-related data possible. Federal, state, and local planners and policymakers can use commuting data from HUD's American Housing Survey to forecast demand, plan for improvements, and guide decisions about how to allocate limited transportation resources. AHS data on commuting costs and commuting modes complement and expand on commuting data found in other federal surveys. And because the AHS sample is designed to produce estimates for 25 large metropolitan areas and some states, the American Housing Survey commuting data help provide a more complete understanding of commuting across populations and geographies. Results on commuting costs and modes of transportation are available to the public in the American Housing Survey Table Creator. The American Housing Survey Table Creator allows users to access detailed AHS commuting to work by mode of transportation and annual commuting costs by type of commuter data, and permits cross-tabulations by socioeconomic groups of special interest to HUD. Who was surveyed? The 2017 AHS commuting module questions were asked only of the head of household and further were restricted to heads of households who were at least 16 years old and had worked within a week of the interview. What topics were covered? The American Housing Survey commuting module questions covered two important topics: how people get to work and how much they spend on their commute. The commuting modes questions asked about driving and carpooling to work. There were questions about the use of public transportation, such as public bus, subway, commuter rail, or commuter rail van and bus. We asked about other modes of transportation, such as taxi, cab, car service, and ferries. There were also questions about walking and bicycling to work. Different from other commuting surveys, the AHS commuting modes questions were designed to capture information about people who take more than one mode of transportation during their commute, such as driving combined with public transportation. All questions were asked within the context of the week prior to the date of the interview. For example, if the head of household normally drove a car to work but used a train the week before the interview, the householder answered the questions about commuting by train. The AHS commuting cost questions asked about what commuters paid to travel to and from work, and about whether the householders received an employer subsidy for these costs. These questions captured the user fees associated with each method. We estimated the cost of driving, including gas, insurance, registration, maintenance, and wear and tear, using standard mileage rates widely used by the government and industry, which was 53 cents per mile in 2017. Responses concerning costs of modes of transportation were also used to calculate the median daily costs by mode, which are included in the AHS commuting to work by mode of transportation module, as well as annual costs, which are included in the American Housing Survey annual commuting costs by type of commuter module. Now, let's look at what we've learned from the survey's results. How much are householders paying to commute? Next to housing costs, transportation can be one of the most costly annual expenses for households across America, particularly for residents in and around metro areas. As I stated earlier, the 2017 American Housing Survey questionnaire asked heads of household about their annual total commuting costs. Data users can review the survey results at the national, state, and metropolitan levels. First, let's look at the national data. The national median annual total commuting cost was $2,226. When we look at national data by type of commuter, we see commuters that drive all the way to work report the highest commuting costs, with a median annual cost of $2,782. Commuters that carpool to work have the lowest commuting costs, with a median annual cost of $1,336. Commuters that use public transportation reported a median annual cost of $1,612. While commuters that use more than one mode of transportation pay the second highest median annual costs at $2,055. Now that we've looked at the costs of commuting nationally, let's look at costs for a few metropolitan areas that the AHS data show have the most expensive commutes. Let's start with the New York City metro area. The New York metro area consists of the 5 boroughs of New York City, the 2 counties that make up Long Island, 3 counties in the lower Hudson Valley, 12 counties in northern and central New Jersey, and 1 county in northeastern Pennsylvania. The New York metro area is the largest and most populous metropolitan statistical area in the United States. Despite being known for its bustling daily commutes, with thousands of commuters largely headed into Manhattan, the median annual total cost of commuting in the New York City metro area is actually about 23% lower than the national average, at $1,716. The most expensive mode of transportation for commuters in the New York City metro area is driving all the way to work, at a median annual cost of $2,782. While the least expensive mode is public transportation, with a median annual cost of $1,716. Later in this webinar, we'll look at which mode of transportation is used most by commuters. But first, let's look at what these data reveal about commuting costs in another metro area. The San Francisco metro area consists of 5 counties: San Francisco, Alameda, Marin, Contra Costa, and San Mateo. The San Francisco metro area is the 12th most populous metropolitan statistical area in the United States, but by some estimates, the San Francisco metro area has the second most expensive commute. The annual median cost of commuting in the San Francisco metro area is $2,098, just 6% lower than the national average. The most expensive mode of transportation for commuters in the San Francisco metro area is driving all the way to work, at a median annual cost of $2,782, while the least expensive mode is public transportation, with a median annual cost of $1,300. Now, let's head back east and take a look at the cost of commuting here in our nation's capital. The Washington, D.C. metro area consists of the District of Columbia and its suburban areas, including several counties in Northern Virginia and Maryland. The Washington, D.C. metro area also includes Jefferson County in West Virginia. The Washington, D.C. metro area is the 6th most populous metropolitan statistical area in the United States and one of the most expensive areas for commuters. The annual median cost of commuting in the Washington, D.C. metro area is $2,782, which is 25% higher than the national median. The most expensive mode of transportation for commuters in the Washington, D.C. metro area is driving all the way to work, at a median annual cost of $3,478, which is also 25% higher than the national average. The least expensive commuting mode in the nation's capital is public transportation, with a median annual cost of $1,560. Now, let's look at a metropolitan area in the southern part of the United States. Some of the largest metro areas in Texas report some of the highest commuting costs in the country. Let's look at the Houston metropolitan area, which includes the Woodlands and Sugar Land and encompasses 9 counties along the Gulf Coast in southeast Texas. The Houston metropolitan area is the 5th most populous metropolitan statistical area in the United States. The Houston metro area has a median annual total commuting cost of $3,302. This is 48% higher than the national median. The median annual cost of driving all the way to work in Houston is $3,617, which is 30% higher than the national median. Unlike in the other metro areas we have discussed, AHS data show that Houston commuters do not make significant use of public transportation. Now, let's compare Houston to Atlanta, another southern metro area known for its commutes. The Atlanta metro area is the 9th largest metropolitan statistical area and consists of 28 counties. It has a median annual total commuting cost of $2,823. That's 27% higher than the national median. In Atlanta, the median annual cost of driving all the way to work is $3,478, which is 25% higher than the national median. Different from workers in Houston, the AHS data show that Atlanta workers make significant use of public transportation in their daily commutes at an annual median cost of $1,300, which is 19% less than the national median. Now that we've looked at commuting costs, let's take a look at the different ways American workers are getting to work. How are householders getting to work? The daily commuting experience can differ dramatically for American workers. For some commuters, daily life revolves around the car. For others, the popularity of the car is waning in favor of walking, biking, and taking public transit to work. As a reminder, commuting questions were asked of heads of households who were over the age of 16 and reported working for pay in the last year. Let's look at what the results from the 2017 American Housing Survey tell us about how Americans are getting to work. Nationally, driving all the way to work is the most popular mode of commuting, with 90% of commuters stating that they drive all the way to work on their workdays. 60% of commuters drive all the way to work 5 days a week. For those that don't drive all the way to work, many use public transportation. 9% of commuters report using public transportation. 4% use a public bus. 6% use subway, commuter rail, light rail, or trolley car. And 1% of commuters take a commuter van or commuter bus. The American Housing Survey also collects data on commutes using other modes of transportation. For example, the survey data revealed that nationally, 2% of American commuters use a taxi, cab, or car service for part of their commute. And 0.2% of commuters use a ferry. Are householders walking and bike riding to work? A growing number of studies have found that active commuting, that is, walking and cycling to work, is seen as more relaxing and exciting than commuting by car and public transportation. Nationally, 4% of American commuters walk all the way to work, while 2% ride a bicycle all the way to work. It is important to note that figures may not add up to the total because more than one category may apply to a unit. How does commuting differ in rural and urban areas? As we noted earlier, where workers live may impact the commuting modes that are available to them. For example, a commuter in a city with a robust public transportation system will have more options than someone who lives in a rural area where fewer modes of transportation exist. The American Housing Survey data allow users to compare commuting in urban areas and rural areas. Let's take a closer look at what it reveals about commuters in urban and rural areas. For example, the data show that in rural areas, 98% of commuters drive all the way to work, compared to 90% in urban areas. And only 3% of commuters that live in rural areas use public transportation as part of their commute, compared to 12% in urban areas. Are Americans carpooling to work? The American Housing Survey also included questions about another mode of commuting to work, carpooling, which the Department of Transportation says can result in health benefits, including addressing chronic disease and reducing transportation's contribution to air pollution. According to the 2017 American Housing Survey, 4% of commuters in the U.S. carpool to work. 3% of commuters are in a two-person carpool, while 1% of commuters are in a 3 or more person carpool. The benefits of carpooling also can be seen in the American Housing Survey's results related to commuting costs. The median daily cost of carpooling is $4, which is significantly less than the median daily cost of driving all the way to work, which is $11. 69% of commuters that carpool travel less than 40 miles round trip to and from work daily. How many Americans are working from home? Finally, let's look at the percentage of Americans working from home. For this discussion, work at home refers to a worker's lack of travel from home to a separate workplace. In the 2017 American Housing Survey, there is not a specific question regarding working at home. Rather, the household member could have chosen the response, "does not leave home for work," on the question that asks about how often householders commute to work in a typical week. According to the 2017 American Housing Survey, 8% of householders that work do not leave home for work in a typical week. Whether you need information on householders who work from home or those who commute to work by car, bus, rail, bike, ferry, or on foot, the 2017 AHS Commuting Costs and Commuting Modes modules feature a wide variety of data you can use in your work. Thank you for listening to this brief overview of the American Housing Survey commuting data. Now, back to your host, Mr. Sean Buchholz.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed that prepared presentation on the commuting data in the 2017 American Housing Survey. If you're just joining us, I am Sean Buchholz, Head Statistical Officer and Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I'm your host for today's presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, one of my goals for this webinar is to help you understand how the American Housing Survey commuting data fits into the overall universe of data the federal government collects about commuting. To help me achieve my second goal, I'm joined by two colleagues. I'd like to welcome Brian McKenzie, Chief of the Journey to Work and Migration Statistics Branch at the U.S. Census Bureau. Thanks for joining, Brian.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I would also like to welcome Clara Rashofsky, Survey Statistician at the Bureau of Transportation Statistics in the U.S. Department of Transportation. Thanks for joining, Clara.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here.
There are at least 7 other federal sources of commuting data that you may hear mentioned over the next few minutes. To help you understand what those sources are and what types of commuting data they contain, Brian, Clara, and I created this helpful chart that you now see on your screen. So I want to begin the questions with Brian. Brian, tell us about your role at the Census Bureau as it relates to commuting data.
Sure. So in my area of the Census Bureau, each branch is associated with specific topics that appear in our various surveys. My area covers content specifically related to commuting and migration, primarily domestic migration. And these topics appear in several different Census Bureau surveys. So subject matter branches like mine do everything from designing questions to routine data production work, like reviewing and analyzing the data, to writing more in-depth reports.
All right, so tell us about main sources of data at the Census Bureau for commuting modes and commuting costs.
So there are several different sources of commuting data from the Census Bureau. The largest survey with commuting data is the American Community Survey, or the ACS. And the ACS includes several questions that specifically relate to work travel. Respondents are asked where they work, time of departure for work, how they get to work, and how long their trip takes. Another survey, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or SIP, asks similar commuting questions with some variation. For example, SIP asks about distance traveled in addition to travel time to work. The SIP also has a limited number of work expense questions as well. So both the ACS and SIP are large general surveys. So the amount of survey real estate is limited for any single topic like commuting. But for transportation research, one real strength of these large, more general surveys is the huge amount of socio-demographic information that comes along with that more specific transportation information that's captured. And so those are some survey-based sources of commuting data. Another source from the Census Bureau is the LEHD program. And there's a particular component of this program referred to as loads that provides origin-destination commuting flows by linking workers' home and work locations, creating a commuting flow. Rather than coming from a survey, this information is gathered from various administrative records provided by individual states for the Census Bureau.
All right, thanks for that overview. So what are some common applications of the commuting data that the Census Bureau produces?
Sure, there are many. Commuting data is used for all sorts of planning and policy-making purposes. Transportation planners and regional planners, for example, use it for travel demand modeling or to measure performance of previous infrastructure investments like roads or transit systems or bike-related infrastructure. It's also used in policy analysis related to various topics like public health, the environment, employment discrimination. The ACS is particularly useful for transportation planning for several reasons. For example, the ACS, it's available at relatively small geographies, even really down to the neighborhood level. It's also released every year, which makes it useful for trend analysis over time. But on a typical day, though, a lot of data users, they really just want to know, how people are getting around in their region and how that might compare to other areas or to the nation. So there's a wide variety of data uses and users.
So back in 2014, you and I had what I recall was the first conversation about commuting cost data needs, or our first conversation. Can you talk about why having commuting cost data is important?
Yeah, so at the time, my team was exploring ways to measure differences in average commuting costs across geographies and populations. And this was part of a larger effort related to the Supplemental Poverty Measure, which is a project that aims to measure poverty by taking into account variation in common household expenses like medical expenses, food costs, housing expenses, and various work-related expenses such as commuting. My team was trying to derive a commuting cost based on a kind of a crude estimation of commuting distance from the ACS, and then approximating that distance, and then deriving a cost based on mileage reimbursement rate. This is better than nothing for sure, but it wasn't a direct measure. That's really what we needed. And then you and I had a discussion at a conference about the possibility of a more complete and direct measure of commuting expenses using an AHS module. And I remember being pleasantly surprised that this was even a possibility. Long story short, the AHS team made it happen over the course of the next couple of years with the 2017 module. And the commuting expense data that results from that module is incredibly valuable. It really fills some important voids in the larger landscape of commuting data.
Well, and you played no small role in helping us sort that out, so we thank you for your assistance. So can you give me a few examples of research questions you think could be answered with the new AHS commuting data?
Absolutely. Lots of exciting examples of potential research areas. For example, the commuting module can help answer questions about transportation equity and access to opportunity more generally. Commuting burdens, of course, vary across places and populations, and they can take on many forms: time, money, or both. And so having reliable data on commuting expenses helps to identify specific populations and communities that experience disproportionate travel burden. For example, we'll use it in our supplemental poverty measure research, and it allows us to show how commuting costs contribute to overall household expenditures. And this information is particularly valuable when it's coupled with information related to household resources. An annual commuting cost of, let's say, $3,000 a year can affect households very differently depending on income. And the commuting module, another example would be research aimed at identifying links between travel behavior and the built environment, the physical environment. You know, travel is closely related to household and neighborhood characteristics like population density or the availability of certain amenities or infrastructure. And the AHS modules ask important questions about these topics. And I'll mention another AHS module, the 2013 Neighborhood Characteristics module. That module asks about access to public transportation. And this is a really important topic, and this information is really valuable and also provides a really nice complement to the new 2017 more commuting specific module. Really, again, linking the physical built environment to travel behavior. And I'll also take a minute to give a quick plug to the AHS Table Creator tool. It's a very fun tool. It's incredibly useful, very easy to use. So I would suggest checking it out for those of you who are interested in this data and haven't used it.
Thanks for that plug, Brian. Appreciate that. Last question for you. What are some challenges in collecting and producing transportation data?
Sure. So one challenge is accurately accounting for the rapidly changing transportation landscape, especially in bigger cities. Within the last decade or longer, we've seen the proliferation of ride sharing, bike sharing, electric scooters, so many other emerging forms of transportation, either new forms of transportation or new ways to use existing forms of transportation. Also, work trips sometimes involve multiple travel modes, and some people vary how they get to work depending on the day of the week or even the season. And finally, the potential to work remotely has increased, and as we've seen recently. So there's more potential for variation in work schedule and location. So it's definitely, to be sure, it's definitely a very exciting time for transportation, but it's also one that's increasingly difficult to measure quantitatively.
All right, thank you. I now want to pose some questions for Clara. So Clara, tell us about your role at the Bureau of Transportation Statistics as it relates to commuting data.
Sure, Sean. So BTS, which is part of the Department of Transportation, collects information on all aspects of transportation. But specifically for commuting, the focus is primarily on where, when, why, and how of travel for planning infrastructure projects and also for congestion mitigation. The department also focuses on the needs of freight transportation in addition to the travel of people.
All right, so what are the main sources of survey data that the Bureau of Transportation Statistics produces as it relates to commuting modes and commuting costs?
Sure, so the biggest survey that is conducted by the department is the National Household Travel Survey, which is actually done by the Federal Highway Administration, which is within DOT. And that survey collects travel information by people and households at the nationwide. And that includes travel to work, but it also includes all types of travel and activities at locations that people travel to. The NHTS is available nationally and generally also at the state level, but it doesn't produce estimates down to small geographies such as census tracts. So BTS has worked to create a product called the Local Area Transportation Characteristics of Households, also known as LATCH, which takes the NHTS data and combines it with ACS data from the Census Bureau to create estimates at the tract level. And those estimates include daily person trips, daily person miles traveled, as well as daily vehicle trips and daily vehicle miles traveled. Additionally, the census characteristics are carried through to this data set. So there's aspects such as household size, household income, vehicle availability, presence of children, etc., that are applied at the tract level. The BTS website includes the 2017 data based off the 2017 NHTS data set, along with a detailed methodology of how this work was done and how it could be replicated, which could be applied potentially to AHS data along with the ACS data.
Great. So given what you know about commuting data, do you see any critical gaps in our knowledge about either commuting patterns or commuting costs?
Well, it's actually a lot of what Brian was talking about, the changes in mode choices recently. But cost has always been a big challenge for us in transportation planning. So traditionally, this data has been collected, particularly in metropolitan areas, considering other aspects of travel. So not so much the overall cost, at least not in a holistic sense. So the survey data may ask about transit fares or tolls, but not the full cost of the work commute. This AHS module is one of the few modules out there, at least that I've seen, that provides national level data on how much money people are spending to get to work. This is particularly important when considering housing and job location choices. The costs of both housing and transportation in conjunction with the availability of jobs affect where people live, including where housing will need to be in the future, and along with that, the transportation infrastructure to support them.
All right, so how do you think the new American Housing Survey data on commuting modes and commuting costs can help the Bureau of Transportation Statistics in their mission?
So BTS is always interested in all aspects of transportation data. So since the cost affects the mode choice, along with housing and job locations, more analysis of commuting costs is definitely an area that could use more research. And while there are numerous econometric models out there that are focusing on some of these questions, there are few that are available at the national level. And so that's really exciting to those of us at BTS who are always looking for these rich national data sets.
All right, so there are alternative commuting data sources such as cell phone tracking or data derived from various apps like Waze or Google Maps. Does the Bureau of Transportation Statistics use those sources? And can you share your thoughts on those sources?
Sure. So we're just beginning to sort of dip our toes into the waters of these big data sets. And they are definitely here to stay. It's a question of how best to use them and what questions they don't answer. So traditional survey data collects a wealth of information about people, but they're expensive and they're time consuming and they're hard to do as a project. The passively collected data on people's movements is much more prevalent. It's collected all the time. And it's the stuff that's collected through the apps that we all have on our cell phones. And then the data is aggregated and it can be used for modeling the flows of people and traffic through our transportation networks. But these data sets are huge and they don't link very well to the person characteristics, which makes them somewhat difficult to use for behavior predictions. And while travel mode can be assumed based on characteristics of speed and the travel corridor used from these large data sets, other important characteristics like trip purpose are much harder to figure out. So the commute, which only makes up about 18% of all trips taken on a daily basis, and not everybody works from 9 to 5. So there's a lot more information that we need beyond just what's available in these big data sets.
All right, so I appreciate that answer. That gets at a little bit of my last question for you, which is, do you think commuting data derived from federal surveys will continue to be useful going into the future?
Absolutely. And I'm not just trying to, keep my job security here, but while that big data is here to stay and it answers some of our questions, it actually ends up we end up with more questions. So, and in addition to that, the models that are created from big data sets are only as good, their outputs are only as good as their inputs. So as a result, we need to continue to collect survey data to sort of monitor how people's behavior changes through time so that we can keep updating our inputs with these models to have good outputs and be able to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Brian, for your responses to those questions. I now want to move to the last part of our presentation, which is to take some attendee questions. And I'm going to begin in order here. So the first question is, can you share with us how the 2017 American Housing Survey commuting data may be helpful for businesses and perhaps even workers? Brian, would you care to chime in on that, since I think you are you interface quite often with business and other data users?
Yeah, no problem. So I think the AHS can be useful in the same way that, for example, the ACS can be useful to businesses and even workers. So a lot of businesses are interested in, for example, the amount of traffic that a particular corridor gets, or population growth. And of course, population growth, is closely tied to congestion or has development implications. So this is a common type of inquiry that we get related to transportation data. Businesses also want to know, about potentially long commutes or travel burdens for their workers. Let's say it's a new business looking to open up a new establishment. They might want to know the average travel time for that particular region or neighborhood. Those are just a few examples.
Okay, Clara, anything to add? Anything you feel you want to add about how this AHS data may be helpful for businesses and perhaps even workers?
Sure, to focus on the worker end, there's a lot of research that's been done recently considering both transportation costs and housing costs. So this is another sort of piece of that puzzle for people to figuring out where they want to live when considering the transportation costs in addition to the housing costs, going beyond the sort of drive till you qualify challenge that many people face.
All right. Thank you for that. Next question. Certain cities have annual commuting costs that are significantly higher than the national average, specifically for commuters who are driving all the way to work. What does the AHS data tell us about what may be driving up these costs? And what else can we learn from these data about geographical differences in travel behavior? So I'll take a stab at that question. One of the characteristics of how we posed the questions to respondents was we wanted to capture all the different ways that they could be charged during their commute. So if you are somebody who is driving all the way to work, you may incur tolls on a highway or a bridge, and you may incur parking expenses. And so our series of questions were designed to make sure we captured all of the costs that you may or a respondent may incur along the way. Brian, anything you want to add to that response?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No, I think you covered it, Sean. Thank you.
Okay, Clara, anything you'd like to add to that?
Nope.
All right. Next question. Are there any points in the data that stick out amongst those that are carpooling, including regional, age group, et cetera? I fortunately don't have all the data points in front of me, so I'd have to look at the data a lot more closely to see if there was something that stuck out at me. But either Brian or Clara, did you guys, as you looked at the data, see anything that stuck out to you on the carpooling side? We'll start with Brian.
No, we weren't. We actually haven't been able to really take a deep dive into the data yet. I'm very curious to see how carpooling trends relate to, let's say, the carpooling trends found in the ACS over the course of the last couple decades. Though, of course, we just have a sort of a one-time snapshot with the AHS, but it'll be interesting to compare the most recent years.
All right. Another question, what does the Census Bureau consider a long commute, and how does this data help researchers studying the effects of long commutes? I'll start with Brian on that one.
Sure. So there's no official definition of a long commute. We do have pretty detailed data from the American Community Survey about commute length. In other words, not distance, but travel time. For example, kind of our big summary table is table number S0801 to get into the weeds here. And it showed that in 2018, 9.5% of all workers had commutes of 60 minutes or longer. And that's just one example of how to sort of conceptualize what one might consider to be a long commute. But in summary, there is no official census definition of a long commute.
Clara, anything to add to that question about what is considered a long commute?
Sure. So that question is a big question in terms of the transportation community as to what constitutes an extreme commute or a long commute. But the cutoffs generally are either about 60 minutes or more or 90 minutes or more. And the reason that time is used rather than distance is because most people have a better sense of how long it takes them to get to work than how far their workplace is from their home. So that's why time is kind of considered. And you also have to remember that around the country, how far you can go within any unit of time is going to vary. You know, in Montana, a 90-minute commute might take 90, or you can go 90 miles. Whereas in New York City, you might go like 10. So there is a lot of variability.
Okay, next question, and this is one I think I can answer. Did our analysis of the data assume a uniform cost per mile for operational costs in every location, meaning the uniform cost to drive? And since fuel cost is a significant part of the mile cost, and fuel costs would differ by location. So the answer to that is for people who said that they commuted by vehicle, we did assume a uniform across the country cost per mile for commuting, and applied that to everybody equally, with no regard to where they are at in the country. So if that is a method or an assumption that a researcher wanted to relax or replace, the AHS microdata, at least for the largest metropolitan areas, indicates which metropolitan area the respondent lives in. So a researcher could come up with their own estimate and then apply that based on geography. All right, next question. I think, Brian, this will be a question for you. My understanding is that the origin destination employment stats don't exactly measure commuting, but the location of the respondent's employer. And a quick look at the numbers show a lot of what would be very long commutes might reflect, or most likely would reflect someone working remotely or at a branch location. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that issue as it relates to the origin and destination data?
Yeah, so this question almost certainly relates to the LEHD loads data. So yeah, there have been a handful of really good research papers done in recent years comparing kind of average commutes for origin destination loads data to approximations using the ACS, and the respondent's right in that it's on average the loads data tends to produce comparatively long commutes, and it's also correct that researchers believe that part of what's going on is that the administrative data associated with the LEHD loads data, it's taking, in some cases, physical establishments into account, the administrative location, rather than the physical or branch location. And the ACS, in contrast, actually just considers where the respondent actually physically goes to work. The two data sources are different in some ways. There are obvious structural differences between a survey and administrative records derived data, but this is a known difference between those two transportation data sources for sure.
All right. Next question, and I can go ahead and take this one. What would it take resource-wise to expand the number of AHS metros beyond the current 25? And is there a general metropolitan sample size below which it would make sense to do for statistical significance? So American Housing Survey every year includes the 15 largest metropolitan areas and then 10 additional large metropolitan areas. So that means 25 big metropolitan areas. If we were to go beyond that, the cost to do another metropolitan area at the sample size that we feel is necessary, it fluctuates a little bit, but it anywhere from 600,000 to $1 million. So it's fairly expensive to go to add another metro to the American Housing Survey. But I will add that the top 15 metropolitan areas by population are included in every survey, and then in each survey we do a rotating set of 10 metropolitan areas. So over the course of 2 survey cycles, we end up with 35 metropolitan areas total that are surveyed.
And this is Brian. I'll add to that it is really handy to have commuting data for the largest metro areas. Metro areas in particular are a really important geography when it comes to commuting. We know that travel behavior doesn't respect county or state boundaries. So the metro area really is a very appropriate geographic level to have, more so than certainly than states.
All right, next question about biking, and I'm going to give both Clara and Brian an opportunity to respond to this. With the popularity of bike share services rising and more bike lanes being incorporated into roadways in many cities, have you seen any trends in those numbers that suggest more people are beginning to bike to work in certain metropolitan areas? Clara, we'll start with you.
Sure, we certainly have seen some increases in the data, and there's a lot more anecdotal data points for this. The proliferation of bike share and scooters share and all the other things that are rolling around out there certainly have changed the landscape, particularly within the large cities. BTS actually has a data set on our website that looks at the accessibility of these services and how that's changed over time. But to answer your question, yes, it's hard to see it in some of these national data sets because they're not available everywhere. And oftentimes the questions are looking at, particularly for the ACS, what's your usual means of transportation to work last week? And if it rained 3 out of 5 days, you're not going to get that bike trip or that walk trip or that scooter trip or whatever. So it's challenging to get at what the numbers really are. But, living in Washington, D.C. and biking to work myself, yes, the bike lanes are getting more busy.
Brian, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Clara mentioned about the difficulties of measuring biking to work. The ACS, for example, only captures the primary travel mode that workers take. And so if it's a multimodal trip, again, I also work in Washington, D.C. I often take bike share. In fact, most days I take bike share to the metro. And so I have a multimodal trip most days, and it depends on the day, the weather, even the season. That's difficult to capture. And so the primary distance for me, for example, would be the distance traveled by metro. And so that's just one example of how difficult these multimodal trips are. We do see at the national level, for example, in 2018, the most recent ACS data are available, 0.5% of workers travel to work by bike.
All right, next question, one I think is really interesting. I'm going to throw this one at Brian and Clara as well. Is there any data to suggest that people who are using taxis, cabs, or car services are using them in place of public transportation or perhaps along with public transportation? Brian, you want to take the first stab at that?
Sure. So I'll mention some recent work that we've been doing at the Census Bureau. First of all, just to capture the emerging ride-hailing, ride-sharing services. So we're doing some cognitive testing at the moment, testing just how to incorporate these services into our means of transportation commuting question on the American Community Survey, and that work is ongoing. So in future years, we'll be able to accurately account for all car sharing and ride hailing services. In terms of trends over time, so again, the ACS is really valuable in that it's available every year and at relatively small geographies. And so, I guess the trick would simply be to look at look at rates of ride hailing. And right now we don't have that as we have taxi as a specific category in our means of transportation question, but in the future we'll have a more specific language that gets at ride hailing, and we'll be able to compare over time. And I think once we zero in on specific geographies, we'll really start to see real trends emerging.
Claire, do you want to add anything to that question about whether there's any data to suggest people who are using taxis, cabs, or car services are using them in place of public transportation?
Sure. It's a difficult question to answer. In the sort of the recent past, the NHTS has questions on usage of ride-hailing services, such as Lyft or Uber. So beginning to sort of get a sense of what trips people are using those services for. So that's going on. We've also seen a reduction in the ridership counts from the various transit agencies around the country. So we know there is a shift occurring. The question is how many of those people are switching their mode from transit to ride-hailing services versus walking and biking versus using their own personal vehicle, or not making that trip at all. So we have a lot of usage of ordering things we need online, particularly now, and they're delivered to us. So it's actually more complex than just that. So there's a lot more deliveries occurring within residential neighborhoods, and that may not impact sort of people's travel behavior, but it does impact the number of vehicles on the roads and the emissions from those vehicles as delivery vehicles are going around and delivering everybody's packages.
All right, so we got two final questions, and I'm going to combine them together because we're just about out of time, and I'll go ahead and take a stab at answering them. First question was, to what extent does your office use machine learning techniques to build prediction models for public transportation? And is this something we're looking to expand upon? And then a second question, how do these data sets account for the way infrastructure decisions encourage or discourage different modes of travel? For example, if you keep building roads and parking, you get more driving. And if you build, good sidewalks and bike lanes, maybe you get more walking or biking. So what I'll answer both of those questions by saying that there's a heck of a lot more that can be done with this data. And we make the American Housing Survey data available to the public via microdata. But if you need to do some more sophisticated analysis with the data, including merging it with other sources like built environment sources, there are opportunities to use the data in a secured environment. And you can reach out to myself or go look on the Census Bureau's AHS website to learn more about doing that. So I want to thank Brian and Clara for joining us. And on behalf of HUD, thank you all for joining for today's presentation on the commuting questions in the 2017 American Housing Survey. We hope this information has given you some ideas about how you can use the American Housing Survey data to examine commuting costs and commuting modes. And this webinar is just one of the many ways we are working to make the American Housing Survey data as easy as possible for you to use in your work. So thank you again for joining us.